Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webinar this afternoon, which is looking at a healthy civic space in a global health crisis. What role for the business sector? Now, as many of you may already know, in many countries around the world, the space for civil society has been shrinking for some time. And this trend has only increased as a result of the current pandemic, where lockdown measures have impacted, for example, the ability to organize. At the same time, civil society has played a really important role in community mobilization, whether that's addressing urgent needs during this crisis, whether that's services, informing communities about the virus, or protecting marginalized groups. What we hope to do today with our speakers is explore the impact of COVID-19 on civil society actors, as well as the potential role of the private sector and other actors in supporting this really important civic space. And this is going to include some of the ways in which businesses are collaborating with civil society organizations, but also what some of the challenges are that still remain and what more can be done to increase their role in this space. Now, with us today to discuss this are three fantastic speakers. We have Bennett Freeman, who is formerly Managing Director at Burson Marsteller, Senior Vice President for Sustainability Research and Policy at Calvert Investments. His 7 years working in the US Department of State also included 2 years as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights and Labour, and he had responsibility for bilateral human rights diplomacy. Also with us is Idayat Hassan, who's Director of the Centre for Democracy and Development, or CDD, a policy advocacy and research organisation based in Nigeria. CDD provides an independent space to reflect critically on the challenges posed to democratization and development processes in West Africa, but also to provide best practices to the sustenance of democracy and development in the region. And finally, but by no means least, we have Christopher Sabatini, who's currently Senior Research Fellow for Latin America with Chatham House. But he's also founded and directed Global Americas, a nonprofit that conducts research and analysis on democracy and human rights, social inclusion and social investment in Central America, and created advocacy tools for activists in the region. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our speakers. A quick reminder that today's session is on the record. But first, why don't we turn to you, Bennett, in terms of how do you think the current landscape, both in terms of civic space, but the role for business, has been impacted by COVID-19?
Gemma, thank you very much for introducing us and chairing the panel, and thanks to Harriet Moynihan and others at Chatham House for convening us. COVID-19 has thrown into sharp relief the challenges that the international community has faced, not least related to civil society and civic space, challenges that have become increasingly apparent and really severe in recent years. As autocracies have acted with ever greater impunity, as too many democracies become illiberal, and civil society itself has been stressed. Civic freedoms have come under threat. Human rights defenders have come under attack. And these disturbing trends have in some ways been accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic of the last 3 months. But at the same time, there's some hopeful signs that a much sharper awareness of the problems but also the opportunities can lead to a different and better world. We all hear about Build Back Better, and that is definitely now very much the agenda if we can grasp it. Business has a particular role to play. Too often, business, not least large multinational corporations, have failed to recognize that there's a shared space between business and civil society around the rule of law, accountable governance, and basic civic freedoms. Civic freedoms like freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of assembly. And just as those are the essential underpinnings of civil society, indeed the enablers of civil society to flourish, so too are those the enablers of profitable and sustainable business and investment environments. So the business response during the COVID-19 crisis has been very mixed. On the more positive side, we've seen significant efforts by companies, large, medium, small, virtually all industries, put a urgent priority on worker and workplace safety and health, and necessarily so. But at the same time, we've seen too few companies stand up to governments that have used the pandemic as a pretext, a pretense to crack down on civic freedoms. We've seen that in China and India, Philippines, Azerbaijan, Turkey, El Salvador, Honduras, Cambodia, Egypt, so many other countries. And we've seen very few statements by companies standing up to that suppression of the shared space. It's always dangerous to single out one company. There are a few others I've got in mind, but one that I would single out that's taken a positive stand is Microsoft, which has worked very closely with NGOs and human rights defenders, as well as with the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights the last several years, and they've made threat detection software available to healthcare workers and human rights and humanitarian NGOs that are under pressure or threat in different countries around the world. There are a few other examples as well we can come back to in the question period. But, and not to betray the fact that I've obviously got an American accent, having a view for the United States, but I have to note that even though it's not directly related to the pandemic, that the Black Lives Matter protests in the US that have spread globally around the world the last month really represent a sea change in terms of the roles and responsibilities of business. Again, not directly related to the pandemic, but a long overdue reckoning with racial discrimination and racial injustice, with tremendous resonance in the UK, France, Germany, elsewhere in Europe, but around the world, and not least resonance in Africa, as I'm sure we'll hear from Idiot. It is really leading to a much greater consciousness for action. But the challenge for business, and I'll end my opening remarks with this point, is to move beyond statements, move beyond symbols, move beyond virtue signaling to concrete, tangible, credible actions that will fully embrace this notion that there is a shared space between business and civil society, that will create new opportunities in a different and better world that we're entering now. And we can talk more broadly about the impacts, the implications for the broader business and human rights agenda, but suffice it to say that this pandemic has turbocharged the debate around not just corporate responsibility, but corporate purpose, not just around obligations to shareholders, but to stakeholders. And I think that we're going to see fundamental challenges too, and I hope changes in the roles and responsibilities of companies with this pandemic as an impetus and a catalyst.
Moving up, thank you for setting out the context for us so clearly. Chris, I wonder if we were to take a deep dive now into the Latin American context, what are some of the trends that you're seeing playing out, and some of the issues, maybe if you have some examples you could share, but also some of the challenges to getting more corporate engagement in this space?
So, Champa, thank you for the invitation to be here. Thanks, welcome to everyone. A pleasure to be here on a very important topic. And looking at the region that I focus on, Latin America, we obviously see some real challenges. And those challenges are not just in terms of the government response to COVID and its effects on political and civic space, but also on, in many of the ways Bennett said, the failure of businesses that in other instances have been far more upbeat, outstanding on supporting human rights issues, have been relatively quiet on COVID. So let me just start a little bit by comparing what we talk about when we talk about closing civic and political space. Because generally, when we talk about this topic with pre-COVID, if you will, we talk about restrictions that the government places on freedom of expression, on traditional and social media. We talk about restrictions on freedom of association, restrictions on the right to protest, restrictions on property rights, restrictions on the rights of environmental activists and the indigenous in many cases, and restrictions on electoral space. In those cases, across the region, businesses at times have been very, very proactive in supporting civil rights and the rights of NGOs to be able to operate. But all of these increasingly are being affected by COVID-19 in ways that we're seeing. Let's take first of all the freedom of expression. We've seen, for example, the president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, try to close down the government's presentation of objective scientific data that could save lives. Fortunately, in that case, the Supreme Court leaned forward on this, and it forced the government to put that up. And obviously, in this case, the Supreme Court was responding in part to a broad consensus within the society of the need and responsibility of the government to be able to provide objective data. On the issue of freedom of association, what we are seeing increasingly is to take the case of El Salvador that Bennett mentioned, a government and a president, Nayib Bukele, who seems to have sort of has allowed COVID-19 to nurture or cultivate his own authoritarian tendencies, has used the military and the police to crack down on not just gangs, but on gatherings of people in ways that atomizes society and has limited the freedom of expression, the right to protest in the country. Similarly, we're seeing threats to indigenous activists, not just carried out by governments, as in say Brazil, but also by illegal loggers and illegal companies that don't represent the private sectors of these countries in the sort of formal sense. They are criminal illicit networks, but the space that has been granted them by the government to be able to operate is putting indigenous activists severely at risk in terms of COVID-19 infections, but also when they protest, they're being dismissed somewhat violently by governments as well. And at the same time, in the case of Venezuela, another situation which is sadly sui generis in the region, we don't even know what are the infection rates in Venezuela because of the government's lack of veracity of its information. There was recently a report by Johns Hopkins University Press and Human Rights Watch that raised serious concerns about this lack of knowledge about infection rates in Venezuela, and also the Venezuelan government's refusal to allow NGOs or harassment of NGOs to provide humanitarian assistance in these countries. This has obviously not been helped by US sanctions on the country in a sort of a very Manichaean approach of us versus them. But we have to understand that in the case of Venezuela, the responsibility lies primarily with a government that is refusing to recognize and respond to people's concerns in a country in which 80% of the hospitals don't have access to clean water or soap or regular electricity. So in that case, we're dealing with not just a crisis, but also a complete lack of information. So what are businesses doing in these cases? And so far we're seeing not a lot. But let me add one more thing that we're seeing in the case of democracy and political space and COVID-19's effects on that, and that is electoral participation, electoral integrity. This has been throughout a concern when it comes to closing civic and political space in the region, but with the delayed elections now in Chile, Bolivia, quite likely in Venezuela, although no one truly knows, we're looking at a situation where social protests before were very active. Now that safety valve of elections has been closed off, at least temporarily, and the effects are, we don't know. So where are businesses standing on this? The truth is that social media have provided, such as Facebook and WhatsApp, for all of their other sins, provided very important fora for the sharing of information that is breaking in the case of Venezuela, the government's attempt to shut down clear information. In the case of Brazil, for example, the sharing of information on attacks by police in sort of the favelas under the name of breaking up protests or social distancing. The same has happened in El Salvador with really chilling pictures of prisoners and police prisoners being lined up by police to break up a prison riot. So in those cases, social media played a huge role. Where businesses have not played as large a role has been really in beginning to push back on the issues of elections. Many of them have remained quiet. We've seen this consistently in past instances, and there really hasn't. When business has been very active in terms of pushing back on closing civic and political space, it's taken usually an election or some event, and that event hasn't occurred yet. I think most businesses and people even are really trying to remain calm in a way that doesn't necessarily rock the boat. The question is when the time comes, how can these be reopened, pried back open? And we'll have to see. I'm going to end on this particularly very sad note. One of the things we're also seeing in Latin America with the pandemic is a crisis of violence against women. Women who are locked down in oftentimes abusive relationships in their homes are finding very little avenues for protection. And this is an area in which private sector has played a very large role in Latin America in terms of establishing hotlines, in terms of establishing guidelines to prevent sexual harassment, in terms of supporting women's rights groups and even pro bono work. But we really haven't seen that. Just to cite one example, and I'll close with this. In Brazil, for example, femicides against women have increased 22% under the lockdown. That is a figure that's far worse than any other countries. And we've heard similar rates in Mexico and other countries in the region. Unfortunately, companies like Walmart, companies like Microsoft that have spoken out in defense of women's rights have remained silent on this particular case that is very immediate and is happening right now as we speak. So I'll end on that, Champa. Thanks again for the opportunity to speak.
Thanks, Chris. And I think you've highlighted a really important point between the public and the private, because I think sometimes with intimate partner violence, it's seen as within the private sphere, so that the norms that we expect in the public sphere somehow don't apply. But it's been well documented, whether it's natural disasters, crises, or conflicts, rates of violence do increase quite dramatically for women. Idayo, turning to you now, do you see similar trends playing out in the African continent? Are there some of the similar challenges? Chris has described a kind of essentially a mixed picture in terms of what's going on. I mean, Latin America is a huge, diverse continent, as is Africa. So what are we seeing happening across the African continent?
Oh, thank you very much, Champa. I think we have the same. I was just busy shaking my head and aligning myself with most of his points. But I'll also speak as a civil society, a part of civil society, in terms of what we are experiencing. There is no doubt that the COVID-19 has taught the whole world, that's a lesson that health actually can cripple politics, economy, and the society at large, particularly for us Africans, where we are very closely knitted. But what the pandemic has done that we've spoken less about is that it has increased the duties and the burden of the civil society itself. So we are conflicted, we are seated, we have a lot to actually grapple with, in spite of challenges we've previously been facing. And most of these groups are the civic rights groups, the democracy promotion, anti-corruption movement. A lot of them are having challenges. In fact, the civil society, broadly speaking, are having challenges in terms of engaging, particularly here on the continent. We rely more on physical meetings. You have to touch a document to even analyze before you can talk about corruption or not. But it is making us to talk about three very important issues, which are challenges to us: the challenge of quality, the challenge of sustainability, and of course, addressing survivor. Survivor is something that Chris has spoken a lot about in terms of civic rights promotion, in terms of a restrictive civic space, particularly with the emergency laws being promulgated, the COVID-19 protocols itself that will not allow more than 20 people to congregate, like in Nigeria. The fact that lots of things, there are no interstate travel, in the guise of saying that we are doing COVID-19 in Nigeria, when COVID killed 12 people, the security agencies had killed 18 then. So that's the question of right to life. So rights are being trampled upon from Kenya to Nigeria to Rwanda, in all parts of the continent. And all these are germane and they are pertinent. And these are duties which the civic actors have, the mandate, but how do they do it? Again, is the issue of sustainability. Where are the resources? Even the funders themselves have lost all the funds in the capital markets. People have to cut staff, they have to cut how to engage, and many groups will actually be closing down. Now, quality is very important. Whatever we do, we want to know impact. How do we deliver quality? in terms of our engagement. Oh, digital is actually well rated, but on this continent, the cost of data, internet connectivity, they are high, and it's actually privileging one part of the society more than the other. So we are also exacerbating inequalities if we don't think through what our engagement strategy will actually be. Now, these are part of the questions that we keep musing about. And elections will come in. In West Africa, where we work, for instance, at the CDD, we have 5 elections to work in before the end of the year. Then we ask, aside from legitimacy of having the elections or not, the issue of participation comes in. But importantly is that on this continent, we do know that the political life of the politicians are much more important than citizens' life. How do you balance that? How do you engage in such a way that you do not exacerbate the existing vulnerabilities and inequalities, which has been further exacerbated with this COVID-19? So you talk about right to education, all classes are online. How many people do have smartphones or tablets or even TV, electricity to power the TV or radio so that they can join those classes? These are just maybe 2 out of several challenges that we are actually facing on the continent. But there are positives, particularly with media, innovation coming through. We've seen the example of Zambia, where the very young people have been able to congregate, hold their protest without a shot being fired, and had over 90,000 people tune in to watch the protests. They beat the state to it, and they were able to congregate, which would normally have not happened. We are now having press conferences on Zoom. We are building new alliances, both local and the north, the south, and within countries also, in terms of sectors working together. And it's very important to say that the Black Lives Matter movement and the killing of George Floyd has been able to catalyze something. And what it's been able to catalyze has to do with a debate and conversation over security sector abuses on the continent. So these are positives. But aside these positives, the real role in terms of watchdog advocacy, and importantly, a trusted source, because we are dealing with a huge challenge where people do not believe there is COVID-19 because of the lack of trust in states. So being that trusted source, doing those 3 roles, performing those 3 roles are missing, are kind of what we are battling with in the civil society here on the continent. But we have nothing to actually show in terms of involvement of the businesses. Yes, the business have contributed a lot, but what they've contributed is more to government in terms of support for government, ambulances. Yeah, they've been very proactive. They've been very proactive in terms of supporting government, but even being that proactive can also be looked at from, okay, there is always a quid pro quo when it comes to engagement on this continent. But how will they support the trusted sources? Who is able to build data, bring data to bear? Who is able to help them in such a way that even the economy can actually be revived? Seems to actually be completely missing. So there is a lot to do in terms of the business engagement in supporting human rights defenders at this point in time where they are actually needed.
Thank you. You touched on a really interesting aspect, and I think I'd like to broaden out all 3 of you to get your thoughts on this, because, you know, on the one hand, we've talked about how business has used its platform to be able to amplify the voice of civil society. That might be social media companies, but more broader than that, whether it's in terms of practical tools as well as their platforms. But the other important role that business has is job creation, income creation. And as Idayat was saying, how do we not exacerbate existing vulnerabilities in societies? And one thing we do know is that the sort of kind of unchecked globalization hasn't brought benefits to all. So what we have seen is deep economic inequalities. And how do you see businesses changing or adapting their business practices to work with civil society to address some of these key challenges around inequalities? Bennett, if I could turn to you.
Sure. No, thank you. It's a great question, and there are several ways that business can act, and we're seeing some indications that some companies at least are moving in these directions. First is we've already discussed the global impact of Black Lives Matter and the impetus now for action, finally, not just words, and not just diversity programs, as well-intentioned as they may be, to address racial discrimination and decades of racial injustice. So that's a very tangible area where business really needs to move. And it's not just, to address racial inequality, it's to address underlying economic inequalities that have been so exacerbated in the last couple of decades. The other area that's critically important is workers' rights. And we've seen a surge really in the last several years in the United States, but in other countries, of employee and worker voice, sometimes through trade unions, sometimes just coming from cubicles and offices and fields and factories around the world. And without getting too optimistic, since I've just revealed my own bias, which is towards, of course, freedom of association and worker empowerment, without getting too optimistic that it's going to surge forward, I do think that we're at a tipping point where employee and worker voice is being heard and is going to be heard even more. Right now, first and foremost, the issue is worker and workplace safety and health. But I think that the focus is going to broaden and deepen towards addressing underlying inequities, wage gaps, and the treatment of workers in workplaces around the world. One of the most disturbing aspects of the closing of civil society space the last half dozen or more years has been the erosion of workers' rights and freedom of association around the world. And I think that the COVID-19 pandemic crisis combined with Black Lives Matters really are going to put an impetus now on workplace and worker rights in ways that both business and governments are going to have to respond.
Thank you. Chris, turning to you now, because I think one thing we see in Asia, and it's true also in parts of Latin America, is often a very cozy relationship between business and government, and not just in the form of state-owned enterprises, but sometimes in the terms of financial or political elites and the relationships that exist. But do you think there's a space there to see some of the changes that Bennett is talking about? What would be the sort of challenges you think would need to be overcome when you think about Latin America?
It's a good question. I'm going to echo some of the things that Bennett said, because I think he's on to something. The first is the issue that workers' rights have been really trampled upon in the last decades. That in the name of globalization, companies and governments have allowed companies to outsource to the informal sector, a large chunk of its labor force. And that's an informal sector that doesn't enjoy basic rights, labor rights as they're commonly defined as freedom of association, collective bargaining, being able to organize to demand better safety. Those have not been available to those groups. And it's sort of been always masked a little bit by a measure which is simple and dangerously so, of just income as a measure of poverty. And so about a decade ago, the World Bank and others were declaring the rise of this middle class, but it's a very fragile middle class measured only by income per day. That just denies people basic rights. So I think, first of all, that nexus between, and I'm going to sound slightly conspiracy theory oriented here, I don't intend to, but between business, government, and also multilateral institutions that were in many ways complicit in allowing this redefinition, a grading down, if you will, defining down of what constitutes a middle class. So the first thing is that. And I'll be honest too, I think in some cases, labor unions have not always been entirely proactive enough on these issues. They haven't done the difficult work of organizing these very amorphous, heterogeneous bases of workers. So the first is that, I think, and to your point, Champa, you know, how do you break this alliance, explicit or implicit, between government and business elites? It's going to take organization. They're not going to do it willingly. And here comes the critical point is, you know, it's going to take pressure post-COVID. We all are realizing this now, although to some of us, I'm assuming particularly Bennett, who's worked on this for a while, we've known this for a long time. But we cannot forget this once the sort of cloud of COVID passes. This needs to be, this awareness needs to be kept up, just as it will with Black Lives Matter. There's one other case that's important too, is, you know, again, this implicit alliance between business and government elites, and that is the outsourcing of responsibilities over healthcare to very deficient public healthcare systems. You know, the truth is, we're seeing in places like Brazil or Peru, the elite have access to private healthcare. Workers, in particular informal workers who don't have access to healthcare benefits, have to deal with the very insufficient healthcare systems, and the implications in terms of their health and equality over health and rights over healthcare are really stark. And so, and we're looking in Latin America, now suddenly we're realizing how much below the recommended threshold governments in Latin America are spending per capita on public health care. But again, we've all been slightly complicit in this, because we've allowed this to, and only now we're waking up to realize, wow, this was not even a bifurcated healthcare system between private and public. It was a woefully underfunded public health system that we allowed to persist. And now we're seeing the awareness. So again, I think, to get to your point, Champa, pressure is going to be needed. I think we are awakening in many ways, whether Black Lives Matter, gender issues, differences in terms of access to healthcare and labor rights. I think this is a time to organize, to keep the pressure on and not let this moment pass.
Yeah, definitely. It feels like, you know, the degree of disruption that's been caused by the pandemic is so great that actually it may be finally a time to force through the sort of systemic changes that are needed. They've always been really challenging to do because the status quo is so embedded. But turning to you now, Dias, because we often talk about businesses like they're always at the multinational level, but they are national businesses, they are local businesses. And in some ways, local businesses are often more part of communities than those big entities that can seem very remote. So how do you think businesses at whatever level, what role can they play to make sure that in whatever stimulus packages that follow, these deeper issues of existing inequalities are addressed, so we are genuinely building back better, and what we're not seeing is a repeat of the same problems that we've seen again and again?
Thank you very much. I think now the COVID, the health crisis, and the outsourcing of health to underfunded public system is a call to action, particularly in the developing world. So either you have money, you don't have money, you have no opportunity to travel to London, to the US for healthcare. So that's even giving another opportunity for businesses on where to actually invest, and the issue of corporate social responsibilities. But I think a lot can actually be done, but this time around, not just for the local businesses who are actually doing a lot, really. So Kano Against COVID is an example. And when you look at it, it's a coalition of individual civil society organizations, and they are pushing for reform in their states, and they are getting help from national companies, but using these resources to engage in risk management, not just the provision of PPEs alone. So there are positives, but there is a lot that we really have to do. And I think there is an opportunity for businesses and civil society to show up their legitimacy using COVID-19 as an opportunity. I think that's one thing we must not lose. Now, again, when we talk in terms of the digital, which is going to be the new normal, that's one way the businesses can actually come in to bring about access in all the interlands in Africa, so that the issue of education, healthcare system can be addressed. Now, workers' rights is also a big issue, really. What COVID has done is that it has actually led to more violations of workers' rights, particularly by the businesses. So during the lockdown, evidence are just beginning to emerge that during the lockdown, many of the workers were not allowed to go to their homes. These were not voluntary. They were forced to stay in factories in places like Kano for 2 months, 300 people working, also increasing the incidences of contracting the virus. So how do we promote workers' rights? How do they respect workers' rights? And how do they further collaborate to show up legitimacy with the labor movement in these instances? And I think that technology is key. One way they can really collaborate is what platform can they help with each intervention? So we are talking about the watchdog. What tools can be co-owned or provided for them to look more in terms of fiscal transparency, which is key for us in Africa now, when we have to deal with this pandemic, which affects everybody, irrespective of social class. In fact, the only reason we are not making headway is because people believe that the pandemic is not real. And if it is real, it only affects the rich people, because all the victims they know are one rich person or a member of a political party or politician like that. I think co-generating data is also a to-do for businesses now, because the civic groups do have a lot of data which can be useful for them. How do they co-own this and work together to gather and to own?
No, it's a really interesting point, and it reminds me of something Bennett said earlier, and to come back to you now, Bennett, about this shift that you think we're seeing between a move away from shareholders to stakeholders. And I wondered if you could elaborate on that a little bit more in terms of what that might actually mean for how corporates may engage better with the civic space.
Well, thank you for that, Champa. There's been a prevailing view in the corporate world, particularly in corporate America, and I would say in the UK, but to a lesser extent in continental Europe and elsewhere, that shareholders are prime or king, and other stakeholders are really an afterthought. But there's been a steady erosion of that view the last couple decades as the corporate responsibility and sustainability agendas have become increasingly mainstream. But that view has not just been eroded, it's been disrupted, I think, in the last several months, both by the pandemic and also by Black Lives Matter. And I think now that more and more companies are recognizing that, sure, they've got to satisfy shareholders, but the stakeholder pressures and expectations are intensifying, and particularly intensifying when they're backed by government action, by government action in the form of legislation and regulation, which we're seeing on a range of labor and human rights and environmental issues in various jurisdictions. So I think that we're at a time of real reckoning across the board, but not least in the corporate world. And I would say that this disruption, while accelerated by the events the last several months, has been one that's become increasingly apparent in the last couple of years. You know, corporate leaders like Paul Pullman, formerly CEO of Unilever, has been outspoken about the importance of stakeholders, not just shareholders. There's been terrific work done by Professor Colin Mayer at Oxford Said School of Business, advancing this theory of stakeholder primacy for business, of a purpose for business. So I think that now that the pandemic has exposed and exacerbated the underlying inequities in the global economy and society, so many of which are frankly caused partly by business, but also by poor governance in virtually every country, that we're now going to see a heightened emphasis on corporate purpose. And I'll just conclude, though, by saying that corporate responsibility and corporate purpose tied to societal benefit, not just to shareholder value, while vitally important, should not be a substitute for good governance undertaken by democratic governments. God help us if we have a future where well-intentioned companies corporate responsibility is substituting for government responsibility based on democratic consent, elections, choice, and empowered civil society and workers.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point, because what we don't want to see is that we let them off the hook, because states have a role to play, and businesses stepping up and doing a better job doesn't mean states have to do less. If anything, they should be doing more. But on that, Chris, you know,
Exactly.
a lot of our questions that have come through have been around some of the democratic decline that we're seeing in many parts of the world. So-called democracies, but behaving in very authoritarian and illiberal ways. To what degree do you think this liberal turn by states impacts on the space for corporates to engage more? In a way, does it give them open up a space, or do you think it makes it more challenging for corporates to engage in civic activism or support civic space?
That's a tremendous question. First of all, Idiot mentioned that the problem of lack of social trust and trust in institutions. And that's driving both the negative reaction in terms of COVID-19 and the refusal to follow, for example, things such as science by its leaders, and the rise of populism. And that's a very toxic mix in these cases, because there's no real precedent in terms of how you turn around public trust on these issues. How do you rebuild social capital in cases, especially during a pandemic, especially when there are real serious doubts about the capacity of governments to be able to respond? And that's obviously fueling the issue of the rise of populists in Brazil, Mexico, Nicaragua, the United States. And that becomes a vicious circle. Now, the issue of this really dangerous intersection between COVID-19 and illiberal democracies, I think it is very problematic. I think in many ways, as a friend of mine who's a professor at Yale Law School said, basically what we're seeing is COVID has shined a spotlight on the pre-existing fissures and problems that already existed. The question is whether it's going to make them worse, or we will become more aware of them. I think as we're seeing in the case of I'll talk about what business can do or isn't doing right now in a second, but as I mentioned, in cases of Brazil, cases of El Salvador, it's given governments more of a free license to be able to close down civic space, crush, or at least temporarily suspend checks and balances on their power. In the case of Brazil, though, we're seeing the Supreme Court begin to push back. We're beginning to see civil society push back, whether in matters of demands for better healthcare, as well as demands on Black Lives Matter, and reducing police violence. So there is some hope there. I think there's several things that it's going to depend on. The first is business, and so far, I can't really say that businesses perform very admirably in these cases. In the case of Brazil, for example, businesses have largely, despite being progressive on some issues, we could argue they've been symbolic, but being progressive on some issues, have remained largely quiet on the more egregious abuses of Jair Bolsonaro. And a large part has to do with the fact that he has in place an economy minister, Paulo Guedes, who's very, very good on issues of fiscal responsibility, on issues of rolling back pension reform, on issues of promoting pension reform. And so businesses have decided sort of not to rock the boat. And that's a problem, because a lot of these things, as we've seen, whether it's Peru under Fujimori, Venezuela under Hugo Chavez, eventually the knife will cut to them. It may restrict others, but eventually it will affect them. And they're too willing to sort of pursue short-term interests and ignore these long-term trends. And I think we're seeing the same thing in El Salvador. We saw the same thing in Nicaragua, for example, under Daniel Ortega, which had a free trade agreement with the United States, is a real base for US manufacturing in that country, but remained quiet as Daniel Ortega squeezed civil society groups, violated electoral standards, basically attacked civil society activists. It simply hasn't been there. So, I would like to believe the business will step up. I think it can. I think it's incumbent that it do that. But again, I think right now we're sort of in a wait and see moment. But certainly, we should use this, trying to turn this into an optimistic moment. We should use this as an opportunity to recognize what we already saw, but it's becoming much clearer to us, and begin to mobilize groups, individuals, and awareness around some of these key themes.
Daya, it's turning to you now. How do you think the liberal turn has played itself out in the African context? You know, Chris has talked about some of the challenges that has posed for civic space, but also the role the corporates can play in that space. Do you see similar issues in the African context? To what degree has sort of increased populism, nationalisms been a challenge for countries across the continent?
Oh, thank you very much. I think all of a sudden on the continent, we are beginning to talk more about right-wing populism and how it's even affecting the COVID response. So this is not just in one country, it's across. And it's further exposed the challenges of federalism, particularly in countries like Nigeria, where you see that what the federal does is different from the states. And two important things, aside from lack of trust, is politics that is actually driving the response. But I think I have made, since the beginning of the pandemic, I have made two very key conclusions. That this pandemic will either remove government, authoritarian government, or it will cement authoritarianism. I think there are no two ways around that. And we are actually seeing it gradually. So if you look at Niger, for instance, Niger is also going into elections. Even before they declared the emergency lockdown on COVID-19, they had started reporting cases. In guise of COVID-19, they were just able to lock up 15 civic actors for protesting and 3 people killed. Again, our Guinea-Conakry pushed through a constitutional amendment and held a parliamentary elections where the ruling party, of course, won. And now that we are actually looking at the new constitution, there are like 12 new clauses, which was not in the initial one, submitted for referendum. And the so-called illegal parliamentarians have so far been sworn into office in May, despite the fact that there is an emergency rule that does not allow civic group to organize. Even in Ghana, when you look at the emergency rule, which was passed into law, without mentioning emergency or anything about pandemic, it gave so much powers and further restricted rights to move. And that is one of the few stable democracy we have in the region. In fact, with what we've seen in Ghana and Benin, who are the examples of the stable democracy, Ghana, Benin, and Cape Verde, out of the 15 ECOWAS countries. So we take out Cape Verde, but you look at what has happened in Ghana and in Benin, where even Benin pushed through a local elections, which was boycotted by the opposition. It actually gave room for worry. So we are talking in terms of rules in one hand, on one hand, that is not allowing people to actually congregate, have meetings, engage, even hold social activities like weddings, but we are pushing forward with things like elections. So they are taking with one hand and they are giving with one hand, they are taking the other way. So we want democracy, we want elections to hold, when you look at the quid pro quo, but the way that is actually being held. Now, in all of this, again, I'll continue to talk about what is happening, even the eminencies in places like Niger, in places like Guinea, where they have a voice. Not like they don't have voice in Nigeria, but you can say that there are also competing national companies who should have a voice. They are not speaking to the issues of violations of civic rights, and at the same time, the government is not doing anything actually visibly. Okay, maybe I should be generous. Visibly when it comes to the trampling of workers' rights. So in fact, at a point in time, we had the instance where a Nigerian company donated so much money in billions to the government, but refused to pay salary and was actually talking in terms of cutting down staff. So why give to the states if you are going to further burden the states in the numbers of unemployed people that will be on the streets?
Thank you. I think you raised a really important point because we've certainly been here before, right? Where you have a major global event, and I'm thinking of all the emergency laws that were passed after 9/11 that then become the new normal. And they're not subject to the usual sort of scrutiny, the checks and balances that the legislative process normally allows for, but then they're so ill-defined, broadly defined, allow for so much scope that it can really shut down the space for people to be able to organize, mobilize, and take action. But Ben, turning to you now, because one of the important roles that civic society does play is in monitoring how other actors are behaving. So what do you think of the current suite of tracking initiatives that do exist, for example, through business and human rights? And do you think they're adequate for the issues that we're dealing with, or is something different needed? Do you think we have the right mechanisms in place that civic space is able to exercise oversight?
Great question, Champa. In recent years, there's been a whole proliferation, really, of tools, many of them online, developed by civil society, various NGOs at the national and international level to track both government and business responses to a whole range of human rights issues, labor rights, indigenous peoples, women's issues. And I've seen a whole host of new tools emerge just in the last 3 months, tracking responses to COVID-19, whether it's workers' rights, workplace safety, impacts on gender inequality, or racial inequality, some augmentation of existing tools, but new ones created, and scorecards of individual companies. So I think that's all very, very encouraging. And I hope we're going to see even more funding and resources for those sorts of tracking tools that will strengthen both transparency, but especially accountability. But as critically important as those organizing and tracking tools are for civil society, again, they're no substitute for government action. And we've also seen a trend in the last several years, really going back a decade now, towards mandatory disclosure of due diligence efforts around human rights issues, ranging from human trafficking and modern slavery to corruption related to extractive industries, and more broadly on human rights practices across the board. Many people are familiar with the UK Modern Slavery Act, less familiar with the efforts now underway in the EU and Germany, Switzerland, other jurisdictions in Europe to compel companies to disclose what they're up to. Conflict minerals has been a focus both in the US and the EU now for almost a decade. So I'm hoping that we're going to see mandatory disclosure of human rights due diligence accelerate to complement and reinforce this growing range of civil society tools. And again, it's just been very encouraging to see how those tools have been sharpened and extended just in the last 3 months.
Thank you. We're coming to close to the end of our time, Chris. So in some ways, this is probably a very, not a fair question to ask. But when you look across the landscape of some of the issues we've discussed today and that you see in your work on Latin America, what do you think is the biggest challenge at the moment that the corporate sector faces in supporting civic space? But where do you see hope? Where do you see the foundations of potentially sustainable, systemic change that can happen?
That is an unfair question, Champa, but I'll try my best to address it. In doing that, I noticed in the questions, there was one question there. I'm going to answer one of the questions that was submitted by text about sort of how to build social trust between business and civil society, because it touches on, so I'm taking your unfair question, making it more unfair, but that's my own doing. So I think, first of all, I think there is reason for hope. I mean, there are examples of what businesses have done in other situations. In the case of Venezuela, I'm thinking of this group, Empresas Polar, which has really provided, it's an upfront formal business that provides a whole suite of benefits to its employees, including even a fund to support funeral costs. That has built a base of social trust that has served that company well not just in terms of loyalty and in terms of efficiency of workers and productivity, but also when the government under Chavez and Maduro, in particular Maduro, tried to crack down and nationalize some of these industries, the workers pushed back. And so, yes, they invested a lot of money in the short term in terms of their own employees' healthcare and other benefits, but in fact, they built a base that served as a bulwark against government encroachment on private property. I think that's both a good example in terms of building social trust and in terms of building and recognition of that long-term connection. And I'll get to this point, I'll get to a more optimistic point in a second, but I also do want to say that, as Bennett said, and this is my fear, having done research for this and looking at this over the last couple of weeks, I do fear that we've sliced and diced a little bit too much all of the different issues around civic responsibility, civic rights, political rights, whether it's indigenous rights and so on. These are larger than that. And so all the tracking activities and projects that Bennett mentioned, I just don't see those either. They haven't been aggregated in any meaningful sense. They're sort of really within still those circles that operate on them largely. And I just don't see the media picking them up in any large sense. Bennett is hitting his mute button. I think he wants to say something. So I'll end on this.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Bennett.
No, I think you're right on there, Chris. And there are some efforts to aggregate through the World Benchmarking Alliance. The Corporate Human Rights Benchmark Initiative is a pretty comprehensive suite of indicators around corporate responsibility across different sectors. But you're dead right. These tracking tools are too siloed, and we need to find ways to aggregate and amplify them.
Good. And I'll end on an optimistic note in that case, is I do think that's exactly the place where the sorts of activities like this can serve as a platform for promoting them and trying to break out of those silos and demonstrate that this is a cross-sectoral issue that needs to be addressed in multiple fora. Because as you said, Champa, this is a unique moment, disruptive moment, but let's try to convert it into a more positive one by doing that.
Thank you, Chris. And the final word I'm going to give to Dayat to talk through what gives you hope when you look at the work that you do and you're working for, as you said, you're part of civil society. What sustains you in the work that you do? What gives you that kind of sense of, okay, we're getting somewhere? And there's, it's hard, there's challenges, but there's grounds for optimism.
That since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, especially when we agreed it arrived on the continent, it's given me hope. It's cheered me up because I see that as an opportunity that must not be lost, as an opportunity for us to galvanize the citizenry. And now the citizenry, not just the vulnerable group, but the middle class and the businesses. So we are all in the same boat. We are all stuck here. We are all trying to shelter and to save ourselves from catching this pandemic, as we say here in Nigeria. So there is actually hope. Is what we now make of this moment in terms of addressing healthcare. Is that reality that, look, healthcare are never prioritized on the continent. Healthcare, education, they are not priority issues. But for once, we are now saying that healthcare can completely shut down politics. It can shut down the economy. So this is an opportunity for us, not just to get the so-called downtrodden, but to get the middle class on the boat and make change happen here. Thank you.
Thank you. It's very hard I think you just framed our conversation beautifully, and there's no way to summarize in any way that would do justice to what you've just said for us. So all that's left for me to say really is a big, massive thank you to all three of you for sharing your thoughts with us. It's been a really heartwarming conversation to be able to hear, not just the challenges, but some of the ways in which you see progress happening. So thank you so much. Thank you to our participants. I try to get in as many questions as possible. And clearly a conversation where we've only just scratched the surface. So hopefully more discussion to follow.